Hi, welcome to the video lecture on labor demand. So last time we have seen them, we have completed the video lectures on the labor force characteristics. And now we will see basically the way labor market is created. And once you have labor force as resource available, now it's possible to have, in order to create a market, you should also have a labor demand that actually requires to buy that resource from the owners of this resource. And then you should have a market that brings them together, and we will see how in mainstream economics this market is looked upon, studied. And then we will see again this market, but with a little bit modification. Basically, we will see monopsony case, and then we will see how far this monopsony case can be basically applied to the actual economy. And you also see the minimum wage case, which is the case where you put a price floor for the labor market. There's a price below which you cannot go. Let's start with the labor demand. Actually, I could put another clip which could be more recent, but I decided this one is doing good enough, so I decided to keep this. So this video is pretty much, it is on the labor demand and different factors that are affecting labor demand, and you can watch and you can see especially the arguments on how unemployment is affecting the people who are actually demanding the labor power. And especially one interesting thing is from the perspective of the unemployed people, the buyers of the labor power, of course. Having abundant people who are willing to sell their labor but are not able to is not necessarily something bad, but it might be bad if those people without experience might lose some of their skills, especially. It's a nice clip. It's a typical news clip you can watch on labor demand. So watch it. Let's. You can stop here, watch, and we can continue. I assume you have watched it. Now, let's start with the background information. When we are talking, labor demand is something that we might think that exists always, but it might be something also strange when you look from the historical perspective, because it is when you have labor demand, basically you need labor power of someone else, which means you and your immediate relatives, your immediate friends are not able to, immediate people who are around you can help you are not able to do some task, and you need to have additional people to do that task. And you are not buying a service from them; you buy their labor power. You use them. Repeatedly. That means that basically, in that sense, for example, if you ask a plumber to come to your house, that might not be specifically a labor demand. If you have a housemate that is always in your house and do what you want to do from that housemate, then that might be a labor demand. Basically, the other one is more like a little bit more like service. You demand a service, not directly labor. Although in a narrow sense, maybe that might also be labor demand. But if you have, for example, a gardener in your house that is employed, that is employed always, that might also be considered as a sustaining labor demand, and you don't buy necessarily a service, but you buy labor power repeatedly from that person. But in narrow sense, or in more strict sense, we might say that labor is demanded when the workers have certain skills you don't have. You might demand labor power of a doctor, for example, if you don't have medical skills, obviously. Um, uh, well, alternatively, you need labor demand if you have a kind of work to do which is too much, too excessive for you, or if you don't want to work. I mean, if you have some resources and you want to rather hire other people, and you don't want to do the work. If you have a large mansion, in that case, you might not take care of that mansion. You might need help to take care of that mansion. Even if you have a small house, you might not want to clean the house. Maybe you might be working outside, so you might demand labor. Or you might have for example, large plantation. It might be so large that you might not be able to plant it yourself, so you might need some farm workers who need to do that. Same thing might be true if you have a huge workshop. So when the production scales were small and people's wealth level were more or less same, so that I mean, usually no one is excessively wealthy to say, okay, I'm not working and let all my work to be done by other people. You might say that labor demand might be relatively small at small levels. Maybe in some excessively rich cities, you might get slaves from other places, and you might let slaves to do certain type of work. Usually workshops were family places. Sometimes you might adopt certain children and basically let them do work. Also, or second children of the families might also be adopted by the families without male children, especially. So basically, usually, I mean, people were demanding. Well, people were actually getting the labor power they need from themselves and from their families, which were more larger than basically we have now. Well, sometimes in very wealthy cities like Rome, for example, you might have some plantations owned by people who might demand large amount of labor power, but usually states demand a lot of labor power, both for the bureaucracy to run basically state apparatus, but also to some extent work in, for example, some big construction projects or mines in some cases in ancient Athens, for example. Well, some, for example, merchants also might need people to work in their ships, for example, or carry their goods when they travel to foreign countries. And states might basically get higher members of the noble families or employ slaves, or now in a specific case in China where basically potential workers are chosen by exams. I mean, the earliest exams in the history was done by the China. And again, in construction projects, also sometimes states or require their citizens to supply a certain amount of labor power per week, per year. Well, as late as in 19th century, Mormon Church in the United States required all of its members to work in construction of temples for every week for a certain time. Now it has become, instead of supplying work, they need to just pay money to the church. Although they still, I mean, young people still need to do work for the church, missionary work, but also some other types of work in some cases. And well, as I said, the slaves was especially for the private citizens the most obvious way to get additional labor power, mostly. And well, later also in certain cities, when there was wealth differences, well, the more wealthier people were able to hire less wealthier people, relatively poor people, especially 19th century and 18th century, basically. But one basic thing that has changed the nature of the labor demand was the mass production. Even in case of slavery, actually, before mass production, the demand for slavery in major plantations in the American continent were especially not that high, at least. But once those plantations start to import what they produce to the Europe and become part of the global capitalist system, they were demanding more, of course, at that time, more slaves. As I said, agricultural labor force is something tricky because, I mean, you should be able to hire workers when there is high demand of labor and not ideally fire them when there is no need for work. But no one wants work in a job where they will stay unemployed for a long periods of time unless they are very desperate. Alternatively, you might have slaves, which might be a cheaper form of labor force. Of course, you need to feed the slaves when you don't need them, but still, I mean, you can lower their life standards to the lowest bearable point as long as you want to do that. So they are kind of cheap type of labor force. Of course, productivity might be a question, but farming might be type of work where productivity differences between people might not be that high anyway. And in case of workshops, especially when workshops were created where hundreds of people were employed. Now, I mean, families and even larger families are not enough. You need to, and poor kids around the neighborhood are also not enough now. Now you need a large scale of labor force working in your workshop, and later thousands of people need to work in factories in some cases. So this is the starting point of the large-scale labor demand. And later this has also spread, just like in agriculture and the industry, to the service sector. For example, previously the supermarkets, restaurants were more like, in United States they called mom and pop type establishments. It's family establishments basically. Even if you have a secondary, third worker, I mean, that worker is seen like a child by the owner of the facility. But later you have this large, for example, hotels, large supermarkets, Walmarts, big Walmarts, and well, professional restaurants like the fast food restaurants, and it is spreading to other type of restaurants also, where again you have a restaurant chain and you no longer have this type of family type of establishment even there. So the large scale labor demand was created as the scale of production, the amount of product or service we produce has increased basically in the economic system. And actually, large-scale labor demand and availability of this large labor force, they are kind of going hand in hand. Without this large labor force, you cannot have large-scale production, and without large-scale production, you cannot hire this labor force. We will talk more on this in the next part. See you in the next part.